Hey guys, it's Cosmic Skeptic, and I'm sat here across from Jack Hancock, who has a YouTube channel called Humane Hancock. We just finished up a discussion about antinatalism, and the original plan was to talk about veganism and antinatalism in one big conversation for Jack's channel, but we realised that the two topics are quite separable. We've essentially got two videos here, so I put the antinatalism on my channel because a lot of people have been asking to see what I think about that. So as you can see, it's a little dark outside. We're about to rewind to the beginning of the antinatalist position, at the time of which, when we began talking about it, we thought it was going to go on Jack's channel. So if we're kind of talking as if that's the case, that was the original plan. But if you want to see our discussion on veganism, which covers many of the same kinds of topics about pleasure and pain and what they should mean, but specifically we talked about wild animal suffering, which is something that a lot of vegans don't talk about or don't think about, the suffering that goes on in the wild rather than just factory farms, because there are far more animals in the wild than there are on factory farms. And what should that commit vegans to be doing? We talked about that on Jack's channel, and the link is in the description. But with that, I leave you our conversation now, long requested, on antinatalism.
So antinatalism is the view that it is wrong to bring new sentient beings into existence. That would include humans. And it's important to note that this does not mean that antinatalists all want to kill themselves, because they make a distinction between a life worth continuing and a life worth beginning. So the arguments for antinatalism fall into two categories. So number one would be that it's wrong to bring beings into existence because of the harm it does to that individual. And number two would be it's wrong to bring beings into existence because of the harm that they will do to others. And the likelihood of any individual doing a large amount of harm to others is quite high. So Benatar describes an asymmetry between the good things in life and the bad things in life. So obviously if we've got an existing person, the good things that happen to him are good and the bad things are bad. But when considering bringing someone into existence, you need to consider the alternative where the person doesn't exist. So Benatar thinks that the absence of bad things that don't result because the person hasn't been brought into existence is good. So it's good that people aren't suffering from wars on Mars right now. They're not suffering. That's good. But he doesn't think that the absence of good things that the person hasn't experienced is bad because there's no one there to experience it. What do you think about that asymmetry?
Yeah, see, this is the crux of antinatalism. This is what I think so many people get wrong, is that I've seen a few people, some people I know as well, who make videos about responding to antinatalism. Within the kind of YouTube atheist community, there's a big kind of nihilism is a big topic, because when people leave their religion, they often get, because they've been told all their life that that's the only place you can get meaning from, they get the kind of nihilistic pit of despair. So the atheist community takes very seriously ideas like antinatalism, because they see it as kind of like, here's a bunch of nihilists who will want to kill themselves. But as you rightly point out, that's not what the argument is. And so the mistake often made is to say like, well, see, the antinatalist thinks that there's more suffering, there's net suffering rather than pleasure. Like, and you shouldn't bring someone into existence if they're going to experience more suffering than they're going to experience pleasure. It's like, that's not the argument. Although Benatar does say in his book that he does think that is the case. Yes. He does think that there is a net suffering.
But that's not the asymmetry.
But it doesn't matter, right? So the first thing that a critic of the antinatalist position needs to do is understand that the antinatalist is arguing that if a life consists of 99.9% pleasure, and that person also happens to break their fingernail, right? And that's the only pain they ever feel, that life is not worth living. Now, putting it into those terms can immediately create the kind of surrealist, so powerfully unintuitive approach that you might deny antinatalism on that basis. I don't think
and we have to be careful with the terms we use, because you said a life not worth living.
Yes.
And that's kind of ambiguous.
Yeah, there are two. He dedicates an entire entire kind of subsection of one of his chapters to discussing exactly.
Because he wouldn't necessarily say that you should kill yourself if you break a fingernail. He's just saying it wouldn't have been worth. You'd rather not have been born.
Yeah, in a footnote, he compares it to being at the cinema and kind of realizing that the film you're watching, like, isn't very good, and it's like, it might not be bad enough that it's not worth finishing. Like, you'll stay in the cinema. It's not worth like leaving the cinema, but like, you can still recognise that it's probably better to not have gone in the first place, right?
And you wouldn't recommend it to anyone else.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly that. But it's the same thing. It's like there's a big difference. So when the antinatalist talks about life being worth living, they mean from the perspective of someone who hasn't been born yet. They don't mean the continuation of life. They mean the creation of new life. But this is the first thing to kind of note about the antinatalist position. Do you consider that to be so powerfully unintuitive that it can contradict the antinatalist thesis? Maybe. That's up to you. I don't like to rely on intuition, but just bear in mind that because the asymmetry is that for someone who's not been born, it is not a bad thing that they'll miss out on their pleasure. Like, it doesn't matter in the slightest. Their pleasure counts for nothing, but their suffering counts for everything. So the fact that they're not experiencing suffering is a good thing. So it's like the pleasure counts for nothing, and the suffering counts for everything. Meaning that if you have a life that is just completely blissful, like just absolutely, like you are living in heaven, utopia, like a place that can't even like conceivably exist. But let's say that it did, like just the most pleasure you could possibly experience. But for 5 seconds, you know, you get a mild headache. Benatar would say that life is not worth living.
But couldn't you challenge...
Or not worth starting.
Sure, yeah. Couldn't you challenge the asymmetry and say that the absence of pain isn't good if there's no one in existence to be relieved from that pain?
Yeah, well, this is one of the most complicated parts of the philosophy, and another thing that kind of goes unaddressed is that, like, it's difficult. This is one of the criticisms. I think he attributes it to Derek Parfit, who kind of makes this point that, like, maybe this wasn't Derek Parfit, I can't remember, but it's like, what we're talking about is what people would prefer, right? So Benatar makes an argument that it is preferable to not have been born than to have been born. But the point has been made that in order to have a preference, you need to be, right? And for every living being, more or less, so, you know, discounting suicidal, depressive people, for people who are already alive, they prefer to stay alive. Even Benatar recognises this, because he says that, you know, you should probably still continue your life. So before you're born, there's no one to do the preferring. So anybody who can prefer to be alive or to not have been born will prefer to be alive, right? And that's the criticism. It's like, how can you say that someone prefers not to be born if there's no one to do the preferring? Well, careful distinction we need to make. It's not about what is preferred, but what is preferable. In fact, we talked about this earlier. I mentioned earlier, and this is what I was thinking of. For instance, like, I don't know, you could imagine like a situation of like a disabled child, or take like an animal or something, who's going to experience pain. Like when we put dogs down, when we euthanize them because we recognise it's what's best for them, that dog might prefer to stay alive, but we recognise that even for the dog, it's not preferable, right? Like from a kind of objective sense, if there can be such a thing. We're not saying, like, when we say that it's preferable not to be born, we don't mean that that's what's actually preferred by the being. And for something to be preferable doesn't require the agent for whom it's preferable to actually be in existence, because we're kind of applying an external preference onto them, right? So you don't actually need that to be the case. It's kind of like, let me think here. It's like people who consider that their life is not worth continuing, people who are genuinely suicidal, and there are of course many instances in which you can imagine that it is definitely better to not be alive. You can imagine, if you can't imagine a situation in which you want to kill yourself and you're just not trying hard enough, you could say, well, that's ridiculous. How could you say that you'd prefer to be dead? Because when you're dead, like, you're not going to be there to do the preferring. It's like, I'm not saying I'll prefer to be dead when I'm dead. I'm saying that it is preferable to not continue this life, right? That's the kind of difference. So you don't actually need that person to do the preferring. And this is, again, something that I've seen in some of the recent responses to antinatalism that I've been watching. It just kind of goes not only just like unnoticed, but kind of it seems like that point hasn't been kind of ingested, because it's put forward as a criticism. It's put forward, it's like, aha, but you know, these people aren't alive. How can they prefer things? It's like, Benatar addresses this, like, up front. It's like the first thing he does, because he recognises that it's one of the most important criticisms. But like you say, the thing to be focusing on isn't whether pleasure or suffering makes life worth living, or if pleasure is what is good or pain is what is bad. Like, those are kind of separate questions that the thesis is based upon. What matters is the asymmetry specifically, right? And what I think is a problem with this, the asymmetry, I mean, is like, take the Mars example. Benatar says, look, we don't care that there's no societies on Mars experiencing pleasure, but we do think it's a bad thing that there's no wars happening up there. It's like, yeah, but just because we do think that, is that how we should be behaving?
We think it's a good thing that there's no wars up there.
Yeah, like, should we be thinking that actually, if we could maximise pleasure by like introducing some life into Mars that we knew was going to have maximal pleasure, then like, should it be a bad thing that we're not doing so? Again, this is the difference between doing and allowing. It comes up in every issue. It's like, we're essentially like allowing pleasure to not exist, right? And that's seen as fine, because like, it's allowing, right? Whereas when you get to when it's suffering, it's like, well, by preventing people from being born, you are doing a prevention of suffering, right? It's like, again, there's that distinction. But as we've discussed earlier, it's like, this distinction seems to be a fallacy at the basis of many many kind of wrong ethical theories or mistaken ethical theories, because there's kind of this moral distinction placed on doing and allowing, and there is a moral distinction, but not enough to actually make this big of a difference, that the pleasure counts for nothing and the pain counts for everything. I think that it is not contradictory maybe, but I think it is questionable to suggest that it should count for nothing, whereas one should count for everything.
And could we not accept the asymmetry and still not go to the conclusion of antinatalism? So say if the preference, if we include the preferences of the people who already exist, that it gives them so much pleasure to bring someone into life, and let's say that bringing someone into the world only causes very small harm.
Yeah.
Could it not be that it's overridden by the preference of the people already existing?
I don't think you can do that. Reason being that, firstly, the numbers involved, like there are 8 billion people alive today. Benatar's quick to point out that we're not just considering the potential pains, or let's say potential, that there will be pains of the children, but our children's children and our children's children's children, right? It will continue to expand. Like the numbers are going to be far, far more in that sense. And the people who are alive, their preferences should count for something, but your preferences shouldn't allow you to like bring about something that's not worth bringing about for someone else. Like because you prefer, like, you know, somebody else might prefer not to be punched in the face, and I could say, but what if there were like 5 people who really wanted to punch him in the face? It's like, it doesn't really work like that. It's like you don't have the right to create someone for suffering when, like, you know, they didn't consent to that and wouldn't consent to that, and if they knew all the facts, wouldn't find it preferable, right? Now, that's the antinatalist argument. Now, the response to that might be that actually, no, there's a difference between like 5 people wanting to punch people in the face and the fact that, like, if you reject the asymmetry, then you could say that actually, no, it is preferable to be alive because the pleasures do make it worth living. But that would be the criticism you want to make. You couldn't say like that the preferences, you can't accept the asymmetry but still think it's worth bringing people into existence. Because remember, like, it's not just like, think of all the kind of potential pain that's going to come about, and we kind of quantify that and put it on a graph. It's like, before they're born, that's all that matters. So it doesn't actually matter how much pleasure and pain they're going to experience relative to other people. It's like, if they're going to experience any pain whatsoever, then it is just 100% not worth living. That's the antinatalist position.
And could we reject the asymmetry and still be an antinatalist?
Absolutely.
Because we could just think, well, life's terrible.
Yeah, so
for most people.
Yeah, that's what David Benatar does. He says that, like, here's the position, you know, there's an asymmetry of pleasure and pain, which means that even a life of mostly pleasure is not going to be worth living. However, you don't need it, because life is mostly suffering anyway, and therefore it's still not worth bringing people into existence, right? So yeah, you can definitely reject the asymmetry, but also be an antinatalist. But there are so many reasons you can be an antinatalist. Like Benatar discusses, you can be an antinatalist because you don't like children, you know, because you just hate them, because you find them annoying, right? Like there are so many reasons you can be, and technically you are an antinatalist if you're saying you shouldn't have children because they're annoying. It's just a bad argument. And if somebody says you shouldn't have children because they're going to experience net suffering, I'm not saying that's a bad argument, but I'm saying, like, you know, let's explore that, like prove that might be the case, it might not, who knows.
Well, he does offer evidence. He talks about the fact that we can experience chronic pain. We know people right now sitting in permanent pain. Yeah, it's just suffering so much, but nobody is sitting down with chronic pleasure. He also suggests that we think the most intense pains are worse than the
most intense
pleasures.
Yeah,
so if we were to offer you now 5 minutes of the most intense pleasure in exchange for 5 minutes of the most intense pain, would you accept that?
Yeah, that's the thing, you probably wouldn't.
So does that suggest that you disvalue pain more than you value pleasure?
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, and again, so that's kind of, I guess that's kind of like another kind of asymmetry, because Benatar recognises that when you're alive, your pleasure does count for something, unlike before you're born. But you could still perhaps argue from that basis that the pleasure there's an asymmetry, not that the pleasure is worth nothing and the suffering is worth everything, but that the pleasure is worth less than the suffering. But then you just kind of re-quantify it. You just make it kind of like a logarithmic scale or an exponential scale or something. You say that, like, you know, here's an equal amount of pain and an equal amount of pleasure. Twice the pain brings you up to here, but 8 times the pain brings you up to here at the same time. You could just re-quantify.
How are we making that calculation?
Well, I don't know, but there would be in principle a way to do it if we think of them as just like processes of the brain. But what I'd say is, like, the more amount of pleasure that you have to kind of like that you have to times by to meet the pain, the stronger the argument's going to be that life is consistently consistently suffering. The thing is if you reject the asymmetry argument, and now we're just talking about a balance of pleasure and pain, then I feel like it also applies, because now it doesn't matter if you're born or not, because the asymmetry only applies before you're born. This would still apply when you're alive. So if life is mostly suffering, and that's what you're using to base the antinatalist argument on, and it's not got nothing to do with the asymmetry, then I think it does become an argument for suicidality. Maybe I'm mistaken in thinking there. I'm just kind of thinking out loud here.
Could you go through that again for me?
But it seems to me so you know how people often confuse antinatalism for kind of like pro-suicidality?
Yes,
The reason for that is because they think, well, if you're against kind of life being brought into existence, then you should want to stop it from continuing. But the way that the antinatalist responds to that is by saying, no, we think it's not worth bringing into existence, because before they're born, the pleasure doesn't count for anything. It's only the suffering that matters. It's not about whether there's more suffering or more pleasure. That's not the argument. The argument is about any suffering is not worth living. Yeah. Once they're alive, then the pleasure and pain does matter. And I'm saying if you reject the asymmetry, so that's the response. Let's reject that response. So let's say now we have an antinatalist from another position, let's say not Benatar's position. Well, Benatar's position, but not the one that he's advocating here. That actually we're antinatalists because because life is mostly suffering. Well, if life is mostly suffering, and if life is mostly suffering, then the life is not worth living. Again, because you can't make the appeal now to the difference between worth starting and worth continuing, because now we're just talking about a balance of pleasure. Then I think it probably does become an argument for suicidality. There's nothing inconsistent about that, but I think that's what it becomes.
Could you not acknowledge that life is net suffering and still think, I haven't got enough reason to end it here, but I have got enough reason not to start it?
I think perhaps the reason for that would be we'd be scared that if we start ending people's lives because they're experiencing that suffering, then that's going to cause more suffering actually because of the reaction of other people. But if you have a button that you can press that will kill everybody immediately, if you're somebody who thinks that life consists mostly in suffering, and suffering and maximizing pleasure and minimizing suffering is the end of ethics, then I think you're ethically obligated to press the button. Right? That's where it leads you. And again, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I'm just saying let's be aware that that's where the argument seems to lead. Now, you can get out of that by saying, actually, no, the pleasure that you live is worth the suffering that you experience once you're alive. You can still be an antinatalist by referring to the asymmetry and saying that before you're born, it's not worth starting. But once you're alive, that doesn't mean it's not worth continuing. Continue your life. You don't need to kill yourself. It's fine. You could even make an argument that says that once you're alive, I don't know how you do it, but you could say that once you're alive, pleasure is worth more than pain. Maybe you feel that way. Maybe that's how you feel, in which case life is actively worth continuing, even if it's not worth starting. But that relies on the asymmetry to make that distinction between starting and continuing, I feel. There might still be a distinction, a distinction in terms of how much it counts. I don't know. There might still be a distinction, is what I'm saying, but the kind of fundamental line in the sand between starting and continuing disappears if you reject the asymmetry.
Would you say it's a fair argument to criticise the fact that in order to say what we're saying here, we are making a calculation between pleasure and pain? And surely we haven't got a tool to make this calculation.
That's also true. But again, remember, this is an ontological thesis, right? It's not an epistemological one or a practical one. The antinatalist philosophy is just to say that, well, okay, let's be careful here. Let's take the second kind of antinatalism. Let's take the kind that is based on the balance of pleasure and pain. The philosophy would be, if life consists mostly in suffering, then we should kill ourselves. I don't want to call that antinatalism, actually, because there'll be antinatalists who still disagree with that. But this position that we're kind of discussing here, that if life is mostly suffering, then we should kill ourselves. You might say, well, how could we possibly know that? It's well, I don't know, but it doesn't make it less true. So yeah, we might not be in a position to actually practically know what the answer is.
I suppose an antinatalist may just say, look, I haven't got a precise calculation here, but just generally, if I look at the world, there seems to be a lot more bad than good.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd accept that in terms of a kind of appeal to experience. Although pleasure and pain is an experiential phenomenon, someone might be able to say that I've experienced mostly pleasure or I've experienced mostly pain. But again, you can be mistaken about that. But it's actually irrelevant to the point, right? We could be in a position where we could never actually know for certain, what is actually going to minimize pleasure or what's going to maximize pain, but still hold to the thesis that those are the arbiters of what, like, ontologically is true about morality. This is a point that Sam Harris makes in The Moral Landscape, which, you know, I disagree with his objectivity in ethics or the way he achieves it, but, like, he makes this point about, it's something like, you know, is it better to end cancer or racism, or, you know, malaria or racism or something? And it's like, that's not an easy question, and we might never actually know the answer to that question. You might say, well, how could we possibly know? But it doesn't mean that there isn't a right answer. In the same way, in his analogy, Sam Harris's, is to say there is a number, an exact number of mosquitoes that have bitten human beings in the past hour. Like, there's a number of human beings that have been bitten by mosquitoes. What is that number? Like, there's no way in hell that we could ever hope to know what that number is, but that doesn't mean there isn't a right answer. In the same way, we might not actually ever know what the balance of pleasure and pain is, but that doesn't mean that there's a right answer about whether we should be living or not.
I want to give you a hypothetical now. So let's say you're having a child and you take a genetic test beforehand and to screen the child for any deformities or anything like that, and you find that the child will be very likely to have a severe disability. It's going to cause a lot of suffering in their life. Would this stop you from having the child?
I mean, there's the would and there's the should. Like, if you say would I, then I have no idea, because it's one thing to kind of moralize about what I think we should do. It's another thing to actually be in that position. It's like being pro-life until you get someone pregnant, that kind of thing, right? And you could still be pro-life, but, like, guiltily get an abortion because you recognise that there's a difference in what you would do and what you should do if you're of that persuasion. What I would do, I have no idea. But, like, in terms of ethics, it's like, I don't know. It's obviously, like, I was speaking to someone the other day who works with disabled children, and we were talking about, I think it was antinatalism we were talking about, or something, you know, to do with abortion at least. And I think we were talking about, like, incest, the philosophy of incest or something, and they were talking about, like, you know, about the effect of having disabled children. And I said to them, well, what's wrong with having disabled children? Right, expecting it to be a kind of gotcha moment, because I'm like, I know you work with disabled children, so you're going to be like, oh, I can't believe I said that. But she was just like, no, like, you know, I love these people to bits, but, like, I wouldn't want to bring one into the world, right? Because, you know, the suffering they're experiencing is really bad. It's kind of almost like an antinatalist argument. It's like, you know, not worth starting, but worth continuing. And I was surprised. I was like, fair enough. Like, good point. I don't know. Like you say, there's kind of practical difficulties with actually measuring how much pleasure or pain someone's going to feel, right? But I imagine there is a right answer to that question, but I don't know what it is. Not because I'm kind of scared to commit to a moral principle, but because I wouldn't be able to do that analysis. I think, you know, you take, like, Peter Singer. He wrote a fairly unknown work in, I think, like, the 80s. It's called "Should the Baby Live?" I think it's called. It's hard to get a hold of. In which he essentially argues that, like, it's as far as I understand, I haven't actually read the book, but I've read what he said in the book, so I might have this mistaken. It's worth double checking anybody listening. But I think he makes the argument that euthanizing disabled children once they're already born is a moral thing to do. But here's the interesting thing: not for the sake of the child and preventing their suffering, but for the sake of other quote unquote normal people, because, like, they'll have more resources available to them, like on the NHS and stuff. And, like, why should we kind of have someone whose life is going to consist mainly in suffering, using up resources of the NHS, when those resources could go to other people who are going to benefit from them more? Wow, powerful, scary, difficult argument, right? But, like, yeah, there's a lot of things to consider here.
Let's take a step away from the hypothetical for a second and think about real life. If you were to have a kid, in all likelihood, this child would end up growing old and seeing their loved ones suffer and die, and they'll probably be ravaged by chronic disease, like heart disease or cancer. What's the difference between this and the hypothetical?
That's interesting. Is that kind of where you were going with this from the start?
Yes.
Yeah. It's like, because you can make the case, or at least, you know, the antinatalist would certainly be able to make the case, and not just the asymmetry kind of antinatalist, but also just the pleasure and pain balance antinatalist would be able to make the case that, you know, it's not worth bringing into existence a child who's going to be disabled. But, like you say, why? Because of the suffering they're going to experience. What about the suffering they're going to experience anyway? Okay. When we talk about, like, severely disabled children as a philosophical example, I think the reason we use it is because we're thinking of somebody whose life essentially consists in suffering. Whereas with somebody who lives a life and then experiences suffering at the end, there is more of a balance at play there. But I think both questions are just the same question. It's just about a balance of pleasure and pain. You know, you might say that in the case of the disabled child and the person whose family die and who gets a horrible disease, the pain outweighs the pleasure, and they're not worth bringing into existence. Fine. You might say that both have some pleasure that outweighs the pain. Fine. You might say that the disabled child doesn't have enough pleasure, but the other guy does, so he should live, and the other one shouldn't be born. Like whatever. Like, I don't know what the analysis would be, but I think it's the same question, right? And like I say, I want it to be clear that, like, just because there's no real practical way to answer this question with any kind of objectivity, it doesn't mean there isn't a right answer out there. I mean, for somebody who believes in kind of objective morality, or maybe takes the antinatalist position or whatever, doesn't mean there isn't an objective answer out there for them.
Like we were saying before about how people idealise the lives of farmed animals and wild animals, I think we idolise the lives of humans. And nobody thinks about, when they think, shall I have a child? Nobody imagines the person growing old and seeing their loved one die and being diagnosed with cancer. Like, nobody considers that part.
Yeah, it's true.
We probably should.
Yeah, of course, but that's something we should take into consideration. But again, like, this is all relevant to the kind of before people have heard of antinatalism or care about like its philosophy. Like, there's always, like, people have all sorts of people have kind of had that thought of like, is life worth living? Does the pain outweigh the pleasure? But just bear in mind that this kind of discussion is totally irrelevant to the antinatalist position of someone like Benatar, because like, he's like, it doesn't matter in the slightest, right? Which if the suffering outweighs the pleasure, it doesn't matter in the slightest if we're idealizing humans, or if they really do live a happy life with more pleasure than pain. Like, if you're going to break your fingernail, your life was not worth beginning, right? Now, I've said that a few times now. This kind of like, even if your life is full of pleasure and only a tiny bit of pain, the antinatalist says that your life is not worth living. I don't want people to take that as me like, degrading the philosophy or insulting it, because like, the antinatalist isn't going to be like, when you put it like that, they're going to be like, that's just true. Right?
Yeah.
So like, that's the position. But like, I think the most powerful argument against the antinatalist position for that reason is the intuitive repulsion that we have to an idea like that. But how far should we trust our intuitions to inform our moral decisions? It's not an easy question to answer.
Talking of questions that aren't easy to answer, I'm going to have to ask you the big red button question. So, knowing everything that you know now, if there was a big red button in front of you to painlessly destroy all life on Earth, would you press it?
Man. I feel like, I'm the wrong person to be in that position for a start. Really am the wrong person. I think that, oh man, yeah, look, I think I might be committed to saying that I'd have to.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate to you then. I can see why it would be why you could argue it's a good thing to do for the planet, for this planet, for the people on this planet and the animals on this planet. But what if there's other sentient life out there somewhere in the universe that are suffering, and maybe one day we can help them, we can reduce their suffering?
Oh, sure.
And we're losing that opportunity by pressing the button.
So I imagined that pressing the button would be
the multiverse being
everybody. But
okay.
Equally, you could also, here's an interesting thought on that, is that like, if we take this kind of like, what about the possibility of this, then we can never do anything ever, like morally speaking, we never justify it, because you could never actually know the full effect of the consequences of everything you do. So like, you could say that like, it's probably a good idea not to go and like mug that person. But I could be like, but what? Like, you don't know that, if you don't mug that person, they might go on to like bump into someone on the street, and that person might get a bit angry about that, and then when they go home, they like beat their wife because they're in a bad mood. It's like, yeah, that's true, but like, when we're doing ethics, like, we can't consider we have to kind of work on a probabilistic basis here. Like, is it probably the case that we're going to live long enough to contact other species and be able to do anything to save them? It's like, I don't think people understand just how far away we are from anything else on the planet. I mean, to get to the closest star to the sun would take 4 years traveling at the speed of light. Like, it's just unfathomable. Is it a possibility? Maybe even not, actually. Probably not, with the amount of time we've got left, before the sun expands into a red supergiant. But like, even if it is a possibility, it's like, yeah, but we've got to work probabilistically in ethics,
right?
I think.
And so, if the button was to cancel out all life in the whole multiverse, everything's gone, you would press it. I guess how about this for question? Why shouldn't you press it?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, I don't think it would be immoral to press it.
Are you an antinatalist?
No, because I reject the asymmetry.
You just think that the planet is net negative in terms of suffering?
Well, this is the interesting thing, because obviously to be an antinatalist in the second sense of kind of the balance of pleasure and pain, you can't just take into account the pleasure and pain of like, you've got to take into account the pleasure and pain of the process of kind of introducing this, right? Like, there seems no kind of practicable way to do it without some kind of big red button. That would have to be the way it's done, because any other way would just cause so much suffering that it might kind of count against the argument. Again, that it's not something I've largely thought through. The thing is, it's like, should you press the button? Like, it goes back to exactly what I was saying earlier, which is like, there is a right answer to that question. Practically, I don't think I can arrive at it. Like, so then there's the other question of, would you, based on everything you know? Like, maybe. I like, you know, there's a good argument to say that a lot of people who are minded as I am, pleasure and pain, etc., probably minded the same as you as well, would press the button as well. Whether we should, I don't think we can know that.
And when I first asked you, you said, I'm not the right person to be doing this. Is the main barrier from you pressing that button a moral uncertainty? You're just not sure. You're scared that you might be wrong.
Yeah, I think it must be. But again, the same thing can apply to what we were talking about in our other discussion about, like, you know, we have an uncertainty about whether kind of intervening in the natural world might make things worse, right? But that moral uncertainty shouldn't stop us from doing it.
Right.
But I think maybe it's a different level of moral uncertainty, or a different kind of moral uncertainty. But then again, it might also just be my kind of bias, my status quo bias, and my bias towards like life being a thing that does exist, and the pleasures that I've experienced and the pains that I've ignored. But that's just an analysis of my psychology. That's not an analysis of any kind of moral principle, because that's the question of what I would do rather than what I should do, which I think is the more interesting question, or at least the question that I would be kind of confident talking about, because like that's my field. I do philosophy, right? But like my own psychology as pertains to these things is a whole other question. But it's a quite a damning one and a scary one. I don't know. Would you press the button?
I think I would. Yes.
It feels like a kind of unfortunate commitment, right? It feels like you've backed yourself into a corner with this moral philosophy. It's like, obviously the reason it's not a problem is because there'll never be a situation in which that button really exists.
Right. Yeah.
Because even if you take, like, you know, you can say, what about the nuclear warheads? It's like, that's not painless, believe me. If you're talking about a button that painlessly kills people, it's like that won't exist. It's kind of like, look, with any ethical theory, you end up with some kind of repugnant conclusion, right? Like any ethical theory you choose will lead to some kind of unintuitive truth. And the reason that those aren't a problem, the reason they shouldn't discount the theory, is because they're so like contrived that they're not going to come about. It's like, you know, you can imagine the Kantian response to somebody saying, because the idea is like, you know, you shouldn't tell a lie, even somebody who comes to the door who wants to murder someone. You should tell them, they're in there, because you shouldn't lie. Because if you do lie and they turn away, and your friend has like snuck out of the window and run around the corner and they get killed for it, that's your fault then. It's like, the Kantian could just be like, but like that's so contrived. Or you know what I mean? Like it wouldn't necessarily be a problem. Like for the utilitarian, when someone says, but what if we had like a utility monster? You know, it's like, I guess maybe I am committed to the view that would be the right thing to do, to just allow some thing that like had a higher capacity for experiencing pleasure to suck all of the pleasure out of everybody else. But like, that's just not the world we're in, so we don't need to worry about it, even though like it's an uncomfortable conclusion. It might be a true one. In the same sense, like a painless button of killing everybody on the planet might be a permissible thing to do, a moral thing to do, but like that might just be one of these kind of repugnant conclusions that's only a problem when it becomes a possibility, and that never will be a possibility.
Well, let's go away from the big red button question then and think more practically about the conclusion of antinatalism. And I mean, do you think that people will ever be equipped to take on this message?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because obviously antinatalism is a very, very fringe philosophy, and it's a very scary one. It's a very laughable one for many people, and like maybe it deserves to be. Like, who knows? Like maybe there's a reason for that. But it's like, you know, so was veganism, so was anti-racism, so was so was women's suffrage. It's like I think that if it is right, then the power of the argument should carry it through to one day becoming somewhat normalized. Maybe.
But then how would you implement policies?
Well, I think that's a question for a future generation, but it's like, I can imagine if you've got people on board, like, because in order for it to be a situation where people thought it should be put into law, there must be a moral consensus in the community, which means that people would probably be self-regulating to a sufficient extent anyway. I don't know, it really depends on what the society's like at the time. Like, if you've got a society that's mostly pro-antinatalist, then it wouldn't be too difficult, right? If you've got a society where people still want to have children, like, how would you implement policy? Well, you probably wouldn't, because you wouldn't be able to. Like, no one would be doing it. So, like, it really depends on the specificities. But I think whether or not it becomes a popular philosophy will depend on two things. Firstly, the power of the argument and whether it's true. But secondly, whether or not people take it seriously and give it the time of day. Right? If all of the people criticizing antinatalism are doing so at a very surface level, having not read Benatar's book, having not engaged with antinatalists properly, not taken them seriously, then people who are kind of thinking about it will look at the antinatalist position, this like well thought out, well constructed philosophical syllogism, and they'll look at the response of people going, come on, that's ridiculous. Oh, what, you're going to go kill yourself now? And they're going to be like, okay, well, I know which one makes more sense to me. So, like, listen, if you're anti-antinatalist, if you're pro-natal, then the best thing you can be doing is probably taking this seriously. Because, you know, it's gaining some traction. A lot of people, since I've started talking about veganism on my channel, because people recognise the pleasure and pain and how it's all related, that I'm getting more requests. It seems unrelated, but people are like, hey, do antinatalism next. You know? It's like, a lot of people want to hear what I say about it, because it seems kind of connected. It's like, it's picking up steam, if not as a philosophy that people are actually kind of throwing their weight behind, one that people are becoming aware of, and realise it's a bit troubling. Because they're like, hold on, yeah, this is all great, but doesn't this kind of lead to this? Yeah. It's like two options here. We either say, don't be ridiculous, come on man, now you're just exaggerating. Or you say, that's a very serious concern. And here's why I don't think that that antinatalism works, because I reject the argument from asymmetry. Right. And I think that the second is going to be far more effective. But again, like, who knows, you know? It's a recent line of thought for me. A lot of people have wanted to know what I think about it, and I've said to them, listen, I'll make a video talking about it, as we're doing now. I'll talk about it and I'll let people publicly hear, but you should be aware, like, this is just something that I've only just started researching. I've only just started reading about. Like, it's open for debate, but I'm one of those people who is willing to take it seriously. Of course I'm willing to take it seriously. Anybody who claims to have a way to minimize unnecessary suffering, I'm going to give them the time of day, right? And if they've put their argument in a concise way that actually makes sense and has some kind of persuasive power, then damn right it's worth engaging with, even if just to reject it. So it kind of tires me out when people aren't even willing to engage with it. But it's fine if you don't have the time, if you're not interested, if that's not what you want to do. But people who are like, I'm not going to engage with that because it's ridiculous, I just don't think that they've paid enough attention.
Sure. And I think that's a pretty good place to end it, actually.
Okay, so I'm not going to pretend like this is natural. We originally, of course, filmed the outro on the assumption that this was going on Jack's channel, but Jack, thanks for having this discussion. I mean, it's been fun. When I came here, I didn't expect to be talking about antinatalism, and I think it's fun. Because, as I say, a lot of people have been requesting it. Now, anybody who's watching this, not only go and watch the video that we did talking about wild animal suffering and veganism on Jack's channel, but also go and subscribe. Jack is someone who, in the style of a lot of vegan YouTubers, will be on the streets challenging people, and some of the questions that he poses to people in the street, I think, are particularly powerful. So go and check it out. But yeah, Jack, thanks for having this discussion.
Thank you for the conversation. It's been great. Thank you.